And that leads us to the third moment, the third point in this medieval debate, Fides versus ratio, right? Faith versus reason. And that moment is with, especially given the times, most intellectually honest, and by all accounts, one of, if not the greatest, so-called scholastic thinkers of the medieval period, a guy we mentioned briefly in passing in a previous lecture, the Dominican priest Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was the first one, or one of the first important thinkers of the time to not only realize, but actually admit that no, Anselm was full of shit. The ontological argument, it doesn't work if you're trying to do this based on reason alone. Anselm says it in the end, it's based on de fide, faith, divine revelation. We know that we can prove this based on reason alone because we have the confirmation of a divinely revealed religion. All right. Thomas Aquinas, again, we're talking 13th century, 1200s. Thomas Aquinas says, all right, to begin with, let's start here. Let's try to be as least presumptuous as possible. Again, admission of ignorance demonstrates humility and is the first step to learning. So Thomas says, all right, let's not pretend. We cannot posit, we cannot say positively what God is. We can perhaps suggest, if not determine, what God is not. And this is a very clever tool used throughout, especially the medieval period, in this so-called scholastic movement called the via negativa in Latin, the negative way, by a negative means. In other words, it's kind of a backdoor approach. I may not be able to say what something is, or even that may not even be a wise starting point, but maybe I can whittle things away, carve things down to get to the essence by identifying and excising that which something is not. So the via negativa, by a negative path, a negative way, in order to try to help one's learning of something. So that's kind of his starting point for everything, Thomas Aquinas. Regarding this specific issue, which is the heart of his famous pars prima, the first part of his Summa Theologiae, or Sum of Theology. By the way, it's not Summa Theologica, it's Summa Theologiae, the sum of theology. Summa Theologiae. He writes it in three parts. The first part, he writes here in Rome, on the existence of God and a lot of other issues that go along with that. And within it, Aquinas comes up with what forever after are erroneously, often in English, referred to as the 5 proofs of God's existence. Aquinas never called it that. Aquinas, being intellectually honest, refers to them as the quinque viae in Latin, quinque viae in spaghetti Latin. The 5 ways that at least a divine intelligence, if not a divine personal being, may be demonstrated. 5 ways. What is the first of those 5 ways? What am I doing? What just happened? I was waving a pen. I dropped the pen. Why was the pen moving in the first place? Why did it eventually drop? Let me rephrase that. Why is a dangerous interrogative pronoun? What most people really mean when they ask why is how. Okay. So how did that happen? What happened? Yeah, the pen was moving and then it dropped. What do we call that in English? What is that? What's going on? Two different actions, two different movements. And so Aquinas' first way in trying to demonstrate the existence of at least a divine intelligence, if not a divine personal being, is ex motu in Latin, if you're looking at your worksheets. Ex motu, out of motion. Everything we observe, presumably a posteriori, still a bit problematic, in the cosmos around us, is in motion. Something puts something else in motion. Whether it's the hand dropping the pen, how did that happen? Because the hand put that into motion. Until we can ultimately draw all of this all the way back, trace it all the way back to something which in itself has no need of being moved, or an unmoved mover. An unmoved mover. This, Aquinas says, we call God. Okay. Watch. What just happened? I know, the same thing as the last time. Try to think of it from a different angle. What just happened? Okay, the pen was moving. The pen dropped. How did the pen drop? Well, you just asked me the last time. You said out of ex motu, out of movement, out of motion. Think of it from a different angle. Critical thinking. What's the reason for the pen dropping? What caused the pen to drop? Well, the fingers released it. Why did the fingers release it? How did the fingers release it? Because there was a nerve impulse from through the arm going to the fingers to do that, which came from the brain, etc., etc. In other words, there was a cause behind it. That's why. That's how. Ex causa. Second way. Ex causa, out of the cause. Causation. Which is actually just a ripoff of the cosmological argument we already talked about. And Aquinas knew that as well, but whatever. Okay. Third way Aquinas comes up with. So we got unmoved mover, ex motu, out of motion. Uncaused cause. We trace it all back and ultimately we come to something that is not caused, right? Causes everything else. Uncaused cause, ex causa. Third way, I know you're getting sick of this. Right. Pen drop. Once again. How did the pen drop? Put it this way. This versus this. How did the pen drop? Third way, ex contingentia, or out of contingency. That is to say, the pen's dropping was contingent, dependent upon the fingers releasing it. Again, everything we observe in the cosmos around us, everything is contingent, dependent upon something else. The grass does not grow unless the sun rises, photosynthesis, it rains, it's nourished, etc. Everything's content until we, again, trace this back to something which in and of itself is not contingent upon anything else, and this Aquinas once again calls God. All right, we're almost done, don't worry. Fourth way, watch this. Watch this. Was there a difference in the way the pen dropped? I think so. Do you have a preference for how the pen dropped? Was one way different than the other way? Was one way better or worse than the other way? Fourth way for Aquinas, ex gradu, out of the degree. We have these adjectives: good, better, best, bad, worse, worst. There are degrees of perfection in everything that we observe around us and even within us in the cosmos, until we can trace everything back to something which in itself is perfect, is perfection in itself, which Aquinas calls God. All right, fifth and final point. Don't worry, we're almost finished with this. One more time. What happened? The pen dropped. How did the pen drop? Or now, if you want to ask your interrogative, why? Hint, hint. Why did the pen drop? This is Aquinas' fifth way, ex fine, out of the end. This is the idea of purpose. The purpose with this, I admit, pretty lame. Look, guys, I'm under quarantine here in Rome. I don't have a lot of props. So what was the purpose of all this? The purpose, the end of this ex fine, to provide the semblance, at least, of a lecture session, to teach a point, right? The idea of purpose. Everything that we experience in the cosmos around us has a purpose until we can trace that all the way back to that which has no need of a purpose, because in and of itself it is its own purpose and is that which gives purpose to everything else. Okay. These are Aquinas' 5 ways then, in an attempt to better Anselm's failed ontological argument. Is Aquinas successful? Remember that paradox I mentioned when we looked at the first of these 3 moments? The ancient cosmological argument. I said there was a paradox already introduced because of this. That is, the ancient cosmological argument, Aquinas rips it off. It's his point number 2, 5 ways, ex causa, causation. We trace everything back until we get to something which is not caused. A Big Bang, if you will. Is that the case? Well, again, as we speak, for the past easily 10, 15 years now, theoretical physicists, astronomical physicists have been investigating this more and more, and they're coming up with rather shocking finds. What is the paradox? Think, critically think. Everything we observe, there's a cause behind it. We go all the way back to an uncaused cause. Okay, Big Bang, 13 billion years ago, the universe as we know it, came into being. Really? This is the paradox, the flip side to that coin. You see it? No? Who's to say there is a beginning? What if there is no uncaused cause? In other words, what if this all just kind of keeps going back and loops around again? What if there is no uncaused cause or beginning? This is the paradox, which is a logical contradiction. The same thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. Aquinas recognized this and called it for what it is, namely infinite regression. If we're trying to demonstrate, prove the existence of not only or merely divine intelligence, but especially a divine personal being, based on reason alone, it's a double-edged sword. Cuts both ways, two sides of one coin. Because based on reason alone, okay, I'll grant you, a priori, there's an uncaused cause. But at the same time, the paradox and consequently the logical contradiction is that at the same time there necessarily exists infinite regression. That is, there is no uncaused cause. It all just keeps going back and maybe even looping around again. Aquinas was intellectually honest enough to not only admit this, but to maintain this, for which he got himself into some pretty hot water. And fortunately for his sake, it was not boiling, into which he would be dunked by the Inquisition. But he was interviewed by the Inquisition when he was teaching at the University of Paris, right, in Paris, after he left Rome and was given his cathedra, his regency there as full professor. It got him into trouble. Why is this problematic? Not just for the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church or Christianity or Islam or Judaism. Why would such a prospect be problematic? Because de fide, based on divine revelation, we know there is a definitive beginning to the cosmos because God says so. God created everything. Hence, there cannot be infinite regression. How does Aquinas get his way out of this conundrum? Very clever. And I think we can give him a pass on this. Aquinas says his defense, his argument is, well, based on reason alone, these two positions must be maintained. This paradox that we just described, right? Based on reason alone. But, Anselm, de fide, we know this not to be the case. So we're back to square one. The whole reason we began this whole thing was to demonstrate the existence of at least a divine intelligence, if not a divine personal being, based on reason alone. And in the end, we are left with it's based on divine revelation. De fide. By the way, I think I missed it. The idea of infinite regression leads to, which is one of the readings that you were supposed to do. Aquinas is very short. It's like 2 pages. De aeternitate mundi, concerning the eternity of the world, because that's what the idea of the idea of infinite regression insinuates that the world itself is eternal. And again, what Aquinas means by the world is what, like the ancient Greeks, mean by cosmos, the universe, is eternal. The eternity of the world, if this is true, which cannot be because the divine God created everything. God is eternal, not God's creation. And that leads to one last point I just want to mention here. The last point on your lecture's notes, or the outline anyway, the Greek word pisteuein versus fides. So what is one supposed to make of this? If one, in the recesses of one's sacrosanct conscience as a human person, thinking, sentient, conscious human being, human person, what's one supposed to make? The Latin term fides is not only translated as, but inherently in that is the problem of understanding what the term really means, fides. What's the motto of the United States Marine Corps? Semper Fi. No, Semper Fidelis. Always what? Always faithful really means always loyal. Blind obedience. That's ultimately what makes a good Marine. Follow orders. Fides. That, in the Christian New Testament, is how a particular concept is always translated into Latin, fides, from which we get the English word faith. Remember, we went over the New Testament readings before. The New Testament, what was it? In which language was it written originally? Greek. And the word used in Greek every time you see in the Latin text fides, or in any modern language, faith, fede in Italian, whatever. The word in Greek used is pisteuein, which you may recall at the very beginning of the course, pisteuein as in epistemology. Pisteuein doesn't mean loyalty, blind obedience, faith. Pisteuein, the Greek verb pisteuein, is a deeper, more intimate knowledge of the other. A deeper, more intimate knowledge of the other. Which presumes there is a relationship involved as well. In this case, with Jesus Christ, with the divine. An intimate, deeper, relational knowledge of the other. Think about that. Because that's a far cry from faith. And with that, we'll pick it up there next time.